So now that we have our movement figured out, and if you encountered a bug where the capsule was falling over, double check that you have on your rigid body on your player. Make sure your freeze rotation on X and Z is checked and it should not fall over anymore. Just makes it so that it makes it so the Z being the blue here and the X being the red means it stays pointed exactly upright. So with those frozen, you shouldn't have any problems with your player falling over. Next, let's talk about jumping. So something that I think will make our maze a little bit unique is if we have some jumping. And in the past, we haven't really had jumping in our games because we've been doing kind of top-down, simple physics types of games. So we're going to have a little bit more coding to do on this. So first of all, we need to make sure that our ground is tagged as ground because we want to know if our player is touching the plane in any way. So we're going to have to create a tag for it, which if you remember, you can come over here to your tags, and it has a bunch of pre-done ones, but we can add a tag. And we're going to hit the plus sign and say this is ground. So now we have ground tag. And then we want to go back to our ground and make sure it is tagged as ground. And just for safe measure, I'm going to go ahead and make sure my plane is also tagged as ground, just in case it just decides that it doesn't want to register on one. We know it'll be relevant to both of them, so that's how I'm going to go about it. So I'm just going to save that, and you might note that it got all bold because I changed a prefab, and right now it is overriding ground in the scene, so I'm going to apply it to all, meaning that this prefab is now the same across any of my other uses of ground. And of course, to avoid that, you could change the prefab itself and do it the other way, but regardless. So we're going to deal with our player movement, so we need to open our script that controls our player. And we're going to use some collision stuff, just like we've done for other information. We want to check for a collision, and we want it specifically to check for the collision of the ground, so we know we're going to need that information. That's fine. Okay. So let's do some setup. So let's go ahead and we're going to serialize. And this field is going to be of type bool because we want to know is yes or no, is it grounded? So remember with our bools, we write them as questions. So is grounded. If we put a question mark, it would make sense. So that's all set up. We need to get access to our rigid body on our player. So let's go ahead and set up the player rigid body in a serialized field. And this is going to be of type rigid body. And we're going to let's call it player rigid. That's something we've used before, so it should look familiar to you. And in the start, we need to get access to that rigid body. So let's go ahead and say player rigid. Typing is hard apparently. All right, player rigid equals, and then we're going to get component, which remember component is, just go back into Unity real quick. Components are these things. Each one of these is a component because you can add a component. So each one of these we want to get access to this particular component. So back in Visual Studio, get component, and we're going to say rigid body. And then this is a method, get component is a method built in, so it needs the parentheses and then semicolon. And you noticed it was throwing a bunch of errors for a second because I went back and forth, but it's all cleared now, so we're good. We have access to our collider, or to our rigid body, which is important because we need that information for colliders. We could put it in player movement. I suppose that's probably a good enough place for it. I don't think we're going to tie anything else into jumping, so we can say in here. So I'm going to notate it. I'm going to say if space is pressed, jump. And so it's tied in player movement. It'll be called an update, so we know that it'll run every frame. So I already wrote it in a way that Visual Studio wants to update, but I'll ignore it. Okay, we've already written it in kind of a way that it understands, so we can extrapolate that if space is pressed, then jump, then is probably an if statement. So if, and then input dot get key down. We want to know when the button is pressed. We want to know that it is keycode dot space, because it is spacebar. And for now, let's leave it at that. So if that happens, then we're going to take the player rigid and we're going to do something called add force, which we did kind of with our spaceship. We're going to create a new vector 3, not vector 2, because we have 3 dimensions to deal with. And we want it to be, let's say 0, 5, 0. So x is 0, we're adding to the y, meaning we're going up, and z, we don't want to like jump sideways all of a sudden. So, and then we're going to give it a force mode, so you can see what type of force it is. And let's just, real quick, we'll go in Google Chrome here, and we're going to look at the scripting API and look at force mode. Force mode. So force mode specifies how a force is using Rigidbody Add Force. So it allows you to choose from 4 different ways: acceleration, force, impulse, and velocity change. Now we know we don't want it to accelerate whenever we hit the button. We don't want to add force to it. An impulse would be probably what we're going for. We want it to just one thrust upward to move it along. So you can see here's the properties. Adds an instant force impulse using its mass. Makes sense. So let's use impulse. Force mode dot impulse. And let's leave it at this right now and save it and see what happens. See how this interacts with our game. So if I were to hit play and my code compiles, if I hit space, I jump. If I run forward and hit space, I just jump forward, which is great. Perfect. Now we probably have one problem where if I hit space a bunch of times, I fly up into the air, which is why we added the grounded tag. So let's go back into our code and we can do a couple of things to edit this to make sure that it checks properly for what we need. So we added the tag grounded, which means we can check in our if statement if it is grounded. So there's an easy way to start with this. We're going to do and is grounded, like so. And then whenever we jump into the air, well, actually, we never state whenever it states it is grounded. So let's go to void. We're going to have to make a collision method. So on collision enter. So whenever the collider begins touching another rigid body collider, which is fine because that's what we want. So on collision enter, we're going to say if collider dot game object dot tag is equal to, so 2 equal signs, and then what we tagged it, which make sure you have your capitalization correct because remember everything is finicky, is equal to ground. And we're going to double check that is grounded is equal to false also, which it starts that way. And then it's an if statement, so it needs something input. We will set isGrounded equal to true. So basically what this is saying is, as soon as we hit a collision and that collision is titled ground, we're going to take isGrounded and set it from false to true. So down here, we've checked in the code, if we hit space and isGrounded, it runs this code. Once it's in the air, we want to set isGrounded to false, or else it will still continue to jump as high as it wants. So let's try this. Nope, that's Visual Studio. Can I still jump as high as I want? Nope, now I can only jump once. Perfect. So now we have jumping. So now we need to create some obstacles. So I would start a whole new maze and create a map in which there are vertical obstacles that the player must tackle. You might have to make your walls taller to make it more interesting, because obviously if we have an obstacle that takes us way up here to the top, we could look over the maze or we could hop over the wall. So go ahead and make another level and make it with a vertical challenge. Make it so that we have to jump to get to other areas in our maze. Once you've completed that, come back and double check and make sure that everything looks as it should.